Think about the last time a major corporation admitted it had a fundamental problem. Not a small issue with one product, but a deep, systemic failure that required starting over from scratch. That's rare, really rare. Most companies prefer tweaking, adjusting, reorganizing, anything except admitting the whole approach needs rebuilding. In the 1980s, General Motors did something almost unthinkable. They looked at their declining market share, their reputation for unreliable small cars, and their strained relationship with workers and customers alike, and they said, "We need to build a completely new company, not a new division, not a new model line, a new company, with its own factory, its own culture, its own way of selling cars, and its own relationship with the people who built them." That company was Saturn, and for a brief moment in automotive history, it looked like this radical experiment might actually save American manufacturing. Today, we're exploring how Saturn rose with incredible promise, delivered real results, then slowly dissolved back into the very system it was meant to escape. To understand why Saturn existed, you need to understand what was happening to American carmakers in the early 1980s. This wasn't just about competition, it was about a fundamental shift in what customers expected from an automobile. Japanese manufacturers had changed the game. Toyota, Honda, Datsun, later Nissan, and others weren't just selling cars, they were selling confidence. Their vehicles started reliably. They required less maintenance. They held their value, and critically, they didn't feel like gambling. When you bought a Honda Civic, you knew what you were getting. When you bought an American small car, you hoped for the best. This wasn't perception, it was reality backed by data. Consumer reports, J.D. Power surveys, and simple word of mouth all pointed the same direction. If you wanted a dependable small car, buy Japanese. General Motors watched this shift with growing alarm. In 1980, GM controlled nearly 46% of the American market. By 1985, that had dropped below 40%. The company was still enormous, still profitable in many segments, but the trajectory was clear and troubling. Young buyers, the customers who would drive the market for decades, were choosing imports for their first cars, and often never coming back to American brands. GM tried traditional responses. They designed new models. They launched marketing campaigns emphasizing American jobs. They even formed a joint venture with Toyota, the Numi plant in California, to learn Japanese manufacturing techniques. These efforts helped, but they didn't solve the core problem. The issue wasn't just in the factory or the design studio, it was cultural, it was organizational. It was in the adversarial relationship between management and unions. It was in dealerships where aggressive sales tactics left customers feeling manipulated. It was in a corporate bureaucracy where decisions moved slowly and innovation got strangled by committees. Some GM executives realized that fixing this problem from within existing structures might be impossible. The system would always revert to its defaults. What they needed was to build something outside that system, protected from it, independent of it, free to operate differently. The idea took shape through the early 1980s. Key figures included Alex Mayer, who led the initial small car project, and Roger Smith, GM's chairman, who championed the concept at the corporate level. They assembled a team and gave them an unusual mandate: design not just a car, but an entire company. The project initially didn't even have the Saturn name. Early prototypes were considered for existing GM brands, perhaps Chevrolet or Buick. But the team quickly recognized that badge engineering wouldn't work. If this new small car arrived wearing a traditional GM nameplate, it would carry all the baggage of past disappointments. Customers would assume it was just another mediocre American compact, no matter how good it actually was. So they proposed something radical: create an entirely separate brand. In January 1985, Saturn Corporation became official as a wholly owned subsidiary of General Motors. The name itself carried symbolic power. The Saturn V rocket had taken Americans to the moon, representing innovation, achievement, and national pride. The new car company aimed to channel that same spirit, positioning itself as America's answer to the Japanese challenge. Saturn received extraordinary autonomy for a GM subsidiary. It would have its own manufacturing facility, built from the ground up with modern techniques, its own independent dealer network, separate from existing GM franchises. Most controversially, it would negotiate its own labor agreement with the United Auto Workers Union, creating a partnership model that gave workers more input and more stake in success. This independence came with a price tag. GM committed approximately $199 billion to the Saturn project. An enormous investment that immediately made some within the corporation uncomfortable. Other divisions saw resources flowing to this new entity that could have gone to them. Chevrolet executives worried Saturn would cannibalize their small car sales. Financial analysts questioned whether the investment would ever be recovered. But Roger Smith pushed forward. He believed, perhaps correctly, that GM needed to prove it could still innovate, could still compete, could still earn customer loyalty in the small car segment. Saturn became his legacy project. The choice of location was strategic. With Spring Hill, Tennessee offered several advantages: a location in the American South with lower labor costs than traditional automotive centers like Detroit, proximity to suppliers and transportation networks, and a community eager for the economic development a major factory would bring. Construction began in 1986. The facility was designed around modern manufacturing principles, more automation than traditional GM plants, but also more worker involvement in quality control and problem solving. The goal was efficiency without sacrificing the human element. By 1990, the Spring Hill plant was operational. Approximately 3,000 workers staffed the facility initially, with that number growing as production increased. These weren't typical GM work over rigid job classifications. Workers were trained for multiple tasks. Pay was partially tied to company performance, giving everyone a stake in Saturn's success. This approach wasn't without controversy. Traditional union members at other GM facilities viewed Saturn's separate agreement with suspicion, seeing it as an attempt to undermine hard-won labor protections. Some Saturn workers themselves felt conflicted, grateful for the opportunity, but uncertain about the long-term implications of this partnership model. Still, in those early years, Spring Hill developed a distinctive culture. Workers genuinely seemed to believe they were part of something special, something different, and that belief would become part of Saturn's marketing story. On July 30, 1990, the first production Saturn rolled off the Spring Hill assembly line, an CL sedan. The vehicle that emerged was purposefully simple, but that simplicity served a strategy. Saturn focused on substance over flash. The engineering centered on a 199-liter four-cylinder engine developed specifically for these cars. It came in two variants, a single overhead cam version producing about 85 horsepower for base models, and a dual overhead cam variant generating roughly 24 horsepower for higher trim levels. The transmission choices reflected the budget-conscious target market. A 5-speed manual was standard, with a 4-speed automatic optional. Nothing exotic, nothing cutting edge, just reliable mechanical components designed to last. But Saturn's most distinctive technical feature became its calling card: polymer body panels. These weren't on every surface. The roof and hood remained steel, but doors, fenders, and quarter panels used dent-resistant plastic. The material wasn't new technology. It had been used in other vehicles. But Saturn made it central to their identity. The marketing practically wrote itself. Commercials showed people hitting doors with shopping carts, bumping panels with their hips, and the surface springing back undamaged. For customers worried about parking lot dings and minor impacts, this was tangible value. It didn't make the car faster or more luxurious, but it made ownership less stressful. The model lineup started simple and expanded logically. The CL sedan came in multiple trim levels: CL for truly basic transportation, L-Line with modest improvements, and CLC with the more powerful engine and better equipment. In 1991, Saturn added the C Coupe, which brought personality to the lineup. Early SE models featured pop-up headlights, giving them a sporty character that stood out in the early 90s small car market. The C came in both C1 and C2 variants, matching the sedan trim strategy. The C2, with its dual-cam engine and sport-tuned suspension, became the performance choice in Saturn's otherwise practical lineup. In 1993, Saturn rounded out the S-Series with sub-wagon variants SW1 and SW2. These were essentially sedan platforms from the rear doors forward, with an extended roof and cargo area. The approach was cost-effective and gave families a compelling option: compact car fuel economy with significantly more cargo space than the sedan. While the cars themselves were good, not revolutionary, but solid and well-executed, Saturn's real innovation was how it sold them. Traditional American car buying in the 1980s and early 90s was adversarial. Customers walked into dealerships expecting to negotiate, to battle over every dollar, to employ strategies and counter-strategies. Sales staff worked on commission and were trained in closing techniques designed to maximize profit per transaction. The whole experience was stressful, often unpleasant, and left many buyers wondering if they'd been taken advantage of even after signing the papers. Saturn eliminated that entire dynamic with a radical policy: no haggle pricing. Every car had a fixed price. No negotiation. No deals. The price on the window was the price you paid. This sounds simple, but it transformed the buying experience. Customers could research prices, know exactly what they pay, and walk into a dealership without psychological armor. Sales staff became consultants rather than adversaries. Their job was to help customers find the right vehicle, not to win a negotiation. The policy had another crucial benefit: it protected Saturn from dealer games. At many manufacturers, aggressive dealers would advertise impossibly low prices to get customers in the door, then add fees and pressure buyers into unwanted options. Saturn's structure prevented that. Every dealer offered the same price, so competition happened on service quality, not on who could cut the best deal. Combined with genuinely friendly service staff who seemed to actually care about customer satisfaction, Saturn created something American automotive retail had largely lost: trust. Customer satisfaction ratings reflected this. Saturn consistently ranked at or near the top in J.D. Power surveys and Consumer Reports dealer ratings. Buyers reported feeling respected, informed, and satisfied with their purchase experience. For a brand selling relatively basic transportation, that emotional connection was invaluable. Saturn didn't just build customers, it built a community, and nothing illustrated that better than the homecoming events. In June 1994, Saturn invited owners to Spring Hill for a celebration. The company expected maybe a few thousand people. Think about that for a moment. When was the last time you heard of car owners making a pilgrimage to a manufacturing plant? Not for a sale, not for service, just to celebrate their connection to a brand. The event featured plant tours, entertainment, and opportunities to meet the workers who built their vehicles. Owners camped out, shared stories, and formed connections with other Saturn drivers. It was part automotive event, part family reunion, part music festival. Saturn repeated these homecomings, and each one reinforced the sense that this brand was different. It wasn't just selling cars, it was offering membership in something. That emotional connection translated into fierce brand loyalty and positive word of mouth that no advertising budget could buy. Saturn continued refining the S-Series through the 1990s. The second generation, running from 1996 to 1999, brought updated styling while maintaining the core formula. The exterior evolved with smoother lines and more contemporary proportions. Interiors improved with better materials and more features. One of the most interesting variants appeared in 1999, the C-Coupe with a third door. This wasn't a traditional four-door setup. The rear doors were rear-hinged, opening backward after you opened the front door first. This suicide door design created a wide opening for rear seat access while maintaining the coupe's sleek profile. It was distinctive, practical, and very Saturn, taking an unusual approach to solve a real problem. Also in 1999, Saturn reached a significant milestone: 2 million vehicles produced. This number validated the concept. Saturn had built a sustainable business selling straightforward small cars to customers who valued honesty and reliability over flash and luxury. The third-generation S-Series from 2000 to 2002 brought the final updates. Saturn cleaned up the exterior styling, replacing the lower plastic cladding with body-colored panels for a more refined appearance. Front and rear fascias were redesigned. Details like integrated amber turn signals gave the cars a more modern look. But even as these incremental improvements continued, pressures were building within General Motors. Saturn was successful, but it was also expensive to maintain as a separate entity. The investment hadn't been fully recovered. Other GM divisions resented the resources and attention flowing to Saturn, and GM's financial situation was becoming increasingly precarious. The corporation began pushing for Saturn to share more components, more platforms, more resources with other GM brands. From a financial perspective, this made sense. Why develop unique parts for Saturn when Chevrolet or Pontiac already had them? But this logic ignored what made Saturn work: the perception of being different, of being separate from GMA's traditional problems. The first clear sign of Saturn's dilution was the L-Series, introduced for the 2000 model year. This was Saturn's entry into the mid-size sedan market, competing against Honda Accord and Toyota Camry. The L Series wasn't a bad car. The interior design placed the instrument cluster in the center of the dashboard, high and easily visible. This wasn't just styling, it reduced driver distraction and made information easier to read. The quad coupe body style was clever engineering. It looked like a two-door coupe but actually had four doors, two conventional front doors and two rear-hinged rear doors. With no B-pillar when all doors opened, the entire side of the car opened up, making rear seat access surprisingly easy. This solved the eternal coupe problem, style that compromises practicality. Saturn also offered a performance variant, the Ion Red line, with a supercharged engine producing about 25 horsepower. This was the same powertrain used in the Chevrolet Cobalt S, delivering genuinely quick acceleration. Saturn even took an Ion Red line to the Bonneville Salt Flats, where it achieved a speed record of approximately 213 miles, an impressive demonstration of the engine's potential. But despite these highlights, the Ion struggled. It shared too much with other GM small cars, particularly the Cobalt. Customers who had loved Saturn for being different increasingly asked, "What makes this a Saturn?" The answer was becoming harder to articulate. The Ion also faced criticism for some cost-cutting choices. Interior materials felt cheap, road noise was pronounced, and the driving experience lacked the refinement of competitors. It sold adequately but never inspired the loyalty the S-Series had generated. By 2004, Saturn's special status within GM was effectively over. The separate labor agreement that had given Spring Hill its unique culture was pulled back closer to standard UAW contracts. The factory increasingly built vehicles for other GM brands. Saturn was becoming just another GM division with all the bureaucracy, cost-cutting, and platform sharing that implied. The Saturn Relay minivan, introduced for 2005, symbolized this transformation. It was a blatant rebadge of the Chevrolet Uplander, Pontiac Montana 6th, and Buick Terraza, all variants of the same GM minivan platform. The Relay was perfectly competent. It offered three-row seating, sliding doors, and typical minivan functionality. Later models included features like StabiliTrak electronic stability control, but there was absolutely nothing distinctively Saturn about it. If you removed the badges, you'd have no idea which GM brand you were looking at. The Relay sold poorly and was discontinued after 2000. It served mostly to confuse Saturn's identity further. Why did Saturn, a brand built on being different, need to sell a minivan identical to three other GM minivans? From 2007 to 2009, Saturn received one final wave of product updates. These were arguably the best vehicles to wear Saturn badges, but they arrived too late and still couldn't escape the badgering problem. The Saturn Sky, introduced for 2007, was genuinely attractive. This two-seat roadster based on the Kappa platform featured a retractable soft top, low-slung proportions, and styling that drew attention. The Sky Red line, with a turbocharged 2.0-liter engine producing about 260 horsepower, delivered thrilling performance. But the Sky was mechanically identical to the Pontiac Solstice. Same platform, same engines, same transmissions, just different exterior panels. Both were good cars, but the Sky's existence raised the question, if GM could build this, why did it need to be sold through two different brands? The Saturn Aura, also launched for 2007, was a mid-size sedan on GMA's Epsilon platform. It offered handsome styling, a range of engines including a 3.6-liter V6 with 202 horsepower, and genuinely competitive dynamics. The Aura even won the North American Car of the Year award for 2007, a significant achievement. Yet the Aura was closely related to the Chevrolet Malibu and Pontiac G6. It was a good car that didn't need to be a Saturn, it needed to be a better Chevrolet. The Saturn Outlook, introduced for 2008, was a large three-row crossover based on GM's Lambda platform, shared with the GMC Acadia, Buick Enclave, and Chevrolet Traverse. But again, why did this need to be a Saturn? The brand had been founded to build small, efficient, distinctive cars. A large three-row crossover was the opposite of that mission. The second-generation VUE arrived as a badgered Opel Antara, built in Mexico. It was a solid crossover with attractive styling and multiple powertrain options, including a hybrid. It even returned to hydraulic power steering after the first generation's electric assist, but it was thoroughly international and generic, no distinctive Saturn character remained. Finally, the Saturn Astra arrived for 2008 as a pure captive import. An Opel Astra built in Belgium and sold through Saturn dealers in the US. This three-door or five-door hatchback used a 1.8-liter engine and offered European handling dynamics. It was a genuinely good car. But it arrived at exactly the wrong moment, as the automotive market collapsed and Saturn's future became uncertain. The 2008 financial crisis devastated the American automotive industry. Sales plummeted. Credit markets froze. General Motors faced bankruptcy. In this environment, GM couldn't sustain 8 brands. The corporation announced in December 2008 that it was considering selling or shutting down Saturn, Pontiac, Hummer, and Saab. For Saturn, this was essentially a death sentence. Once the possibility of closure became public, sales collapsed further. Who wants to buy a car from a brand that might not exist in a year? A potential savior emerged. The Penske Automotive Group, a major dealership operator, expressed interest in acquiring Saturn. The plan seemed plausible. Penske would take over the brand, maintain the dealer network, and source vehicles from manufacturers. But the plan collapsed in September 2009. Penske couldn't secure a long-term manufacturing partner willing to supply vehicles for Saturn dealers to sell. Without cars, a car brand cannot exist. On October 31, 2009, GM announced Saturn would be discontinued. The last Saturn were built in October 2009 at Spring Hill. The brand officially closed in 2010. Dealers were bought out or converted to other franchises. Spring Hill eventually became a GM facility building other brands' vehicles. The Saturn experiment was over. So what do we make of Saturn's story? In purely business terms, Saturn was a failure. The brand never fully recovered GM's multi-billion-dollar investment. It existed for about 20 years and ultimately disappeared without saving GM or transforming the American automotive industry. But that's not the complete picture. In its first decade, Saturn proved several important things. It proved that American manufacturers could build reliable small cars when they approached the challenge seriously. It proved that transparent, respectful sales practices could create fierce customer loyalty. It proved that involving workers as partners rather than adversaries could create positive outcomes. Saturn's early success wasn't an accident or a fluke. It was the result of doing things differently. When the brand operated independently, maintained its distinctive identity, and stayed true to its founding principles, it worked. The tragedy is that Saturn couldn't maintain that independence. GM's financial pressures, internal politics, and conventional business logic gradually pulled Saturn back into standard corporate practices. Platform sharing made financial sense. Rebadging saved development costs. Integrating labor agreements simplified operations. But each of these rational business decisions eroded what made Saturn special. By the late 2000s, Saturn had become what it was created to escape, just another GM brand selling rebadged vehicles that customers had no compelling reason to choose. Could Saturn have survived with continued independence? Possibly. If GM had maintained Saturn as a truly separate entity, allowed it to develop unique products, and protected it from corporate homogenization, the brand might have continued building its loyal customer base. But that would have required GM to do something very difficult: let go. Let Saturn operate without interference, even when that meant Saturn doing things differently than the rest of the corporation. GM ultimately couldn't do that. The Saturn story is ultimately about the difficulty of real change. Creating something new is relatively easy. Protecting it from the gravity of established systems is far harder. Saturn launched with genuine innovation, not in technology but in approach, and for a while that was enough. Customers responded, communities formed, the brand succeeded. But innovation requires protection. Justified. Christians in buyers matter. When Saturn lost its independence and became just another piece of GMA's corporate puzzle, it lost its reason for existing. A different kind of car company can't survive by becoming the same kind of car company. The Spring Hill homecomings, the no-haggle pricing, the community spirit, these weren't marketing gimmicks. They were the natural result of an organization genuinely trying to operate differently. When that genuine difference disappeared, replaced by corporate strategy and platform sharing, the community disappeared too. What's your perspective on Saturn? Was it a noble experiment that proved real change was possible? Or was it a doomed idea from the start, too expensive and too different to survive within a traditional corporation? If you owned a Saturn, any model, any generation, share your experience in the comments. What drew you to the brand? How did the car serve you? Did you feel part of that Saturn community? Or was it just another car? These stories matter because they're about more than automobiles. They're about whether large organizations can truly innovate, whether different approaches can succeed, and whether customer loyalty can be earned through honesty and respect rather than just product superiority. Saturn tried to answer those questions. For a brief period, it seemed like the answer might be yes. Then reality intervened, and we're left wondering what might have been. Thanks for watching. If you'd like more automotive history deep dives, subscribe and let me know what stories you'd like to hear next. See you soon.